Hey everyone. Oh, let me put that up there. How's it going today? Today we are on day 6. I appreciate everyone everyone who commented that. I appreciate your patience with not having a class yesterday. And so today's lesson, we're going to start talking about the diets. Let me get my other computer up here rolling so I can see what's going on. So I hope that you've had a chance to watch some of the other videos. Ideally, you've actually watched them all. And so you're seeing how it's kind of making some sense, how things are one concept and idea is building on the next. And so today I wanted to cover the diets. And the reason for that is because, we've talked about the anatomy and physiology of your digestive system. We've talked about what dysbiosis is, what leaky gut is, what the normal expectations for your gut microbiome are based on our understandings right now in science, and some of the causes, where we get our initial inoculation, some of the causes of leaky gut that we are all exposed to at varying degrees in our modern day. We've talked about some like the advanced topics like SIBO and gut overgrowth. We covered probiotics and prebiotics. And so today we're going to talk about diets. And the reason I saved this one for almost our last is because really after your initial, creation of your initial flora from the birth process, from nursing, ideally all these things happen, playing in the dirt as a kid. The most important thing we can do that has a part to play in how healthy and diverse our microbiome is, or one of the most important things, is how we eat. Because the food we eat not only feeds and nourishes us, or doesn't, as the case may be, but also feeds and nourishes our gut bacteria, funguses, viruses, parasites. That's their food also. And so whatever the food that we give to our gut microbiome will cause for different populations to grow, different things to happen in there. So dietary interventions are certainly one of the most common things people try once we realize that our kids' symptoms, or even our own symptoms, hyperactivity, inattention, autoimmune problems, things on the autism spectrum, and so on and so forth, could be caused by gut problems or nutritional issues. And there are a ton of diets out there. So I'm going to cover basically the ones that I see that are the most, both the most common in terms of what I see people trying and having some success with, and really kind of the ones that are the most accepted, most common, and have shown at least some varying degrees of success based on what their purpose is and if they're used properly, and so on and so forth. So I'm just kind of waiting here a few moments to see if we can get give some time for other people to get on live with us. This may be a video that inspires some questions. I don't know. I've been getting a lot of questions sort of after the fact, which makes sense. A lot of people, their schedule doesn't maybe match up with mine. They're in different time zones, so it's harder to be on the videos live. But here we are today doing number 6. So, all right. So without further ado, I'm going to switch on over here and start sharing my screen, and we're going to just jump right in. There we go. Okay. Excellent. So Gut Health 101, Day 6, the diets. So today's agenda is an overview of the most common dietary approaches to leaky gut. And like I was saying in my preamble, there's no true gut healing can take place without changing/improving the diet. And this is true in all cases because whether the reason for the dysbiosis and leaky gut has directly to do with exposure to glyphosate or antibiotics or these different things, vaccines and C-section birth and so forth. Improving the diet is something that we can all do and all benefit our bacteria as a result of. So like this happy kid eating a vegetable will tell us. Okay, so we're just going to dive right into the diets. So the first one we're going to talk about is what's called GFCF, or in other words, gluten-free, casein-free. So gluten is the name of a common protein found in wheat, barley, rye, in the most quantities, and casein is the protein found in milk products. So this is actually one of the most common and most popular diets that we see applied and used for dietary interventions for particularly the autism spectrum and ADHD. But a lot of people have, well, especially gluten-free has become really popular lately, obviously. If you've been paying any attention, you see there's tons of gluten-free products out there. And there are a number of reasons why gluten-free has become so popular and why a lot of people have improvement when they remove gluten from their diet. And then casein, secondarily, though similar, we see a lot of people have improvement of symptoms. So we see a lot of skin things clear up. We see a lot of fuzzy thinking, brain fog type stuff clear up. And we're going to jump in here. Let's see. So, and then in terms of with kids who have behavioral issues, either ADHD or on the autism spectrum, there have been, this is the most studied diet also for intervention in these type of chronic illness problems, chronic health challenges. So multiple studies have shown both positive changes and no changes. And then there was this recent review of 6 randomized controlled trials. Then most improvements were based on parents' reports with little other evidence of effectiveness. So that's kind of misleading because that's how the studies were assessing the benefits, was on behavioral changes, and the parents are the ones most tapped in and tuned into the behavioral changes. They'd also be the ones involved in the study with their kids. So it kind of makes it sound like that's not really based on much, but I would say parental reports are a very good sense of effectiveness. And then the last little sentence here, no adverse effects. And so I think that's important to keep in mind with a lot of these dietary interventions, especially like this one, for example. There aren't adverse effects that we see with people as a result of removing gluten and casein foods from their diet. And then despite the studies, some of the studies show no change, or it's mixed results. About 20% of the autism spectrum kids have tried this diet, and an equivalent number of ADHD kids. And then in all cases, it appears to be the most effective for children with known sensitivity to gluten or casein, obviously, or who have GI symptoms already. So if the kids had GI symptoms and these other behavioral symptoms, then those ones tended to seem to respond the best or the most favorably to removing gluten and casein. And then the recent randomized trial of 80 children, half placed on a gluten-free diet, significant reduction in GI symptoms and improvement in behavioral symptoms in the half that were on the gluten-free diet. So we see that this has been sort of the most researched in terms of control studies and so forth. And typically, this is a very good place to start, really, with anyone having any kind of challenges, health challenges, autoimmune situations, behavioral issues, brain fog, any of that kind of stuff. It'd be worth trying this out. Now, keep in mind that if we have a leaky gut situation, in ourselves, our kids, and whoever we're trying this with, that if casein is a problem, we will start seeing significant changes in terms of improvement, really in a matter of weeks to a month or two. Gluten, on the other hand, typically you won't see the changes in any significant way, often for months, and it can really take up to 9 months, even 12 months before we see the full-on healing from a gluten sensitivity injury. So totally worth it, but keep in mind it's not like you're going to cut gluten out and see a change the next day. And the other thing I should mention with especially gluten is that it's not dose dependent. And so what that means is that if you're trying gluten-free and want to see if that's going to help your child or your family or yourself, it has to be 100%. So you can be not eat any gluten. You can be 100% gluten-free and have one exposure, and the effects of that can last a week or even several weeks because it's an immune response. There's an immune response that occurs that leads to the leaky gut and the inflammation in our gut lining and so forth. So really, to really test gluten-free out, one has to be 100% and be 100% for at least several months. So gluten-free, casein-free, that's the most popular, like I said. And like if you've been paying attention, gluten-free is everywhere. And the casein is the protein in dairy that seems to be most problematic. And the other thing I'll mention about these two is that here's what we find is that you might have heard of this concept of glutamorphines or caseomorphines. And I think I even mentioned it earlier on in this course. But so what can happen, is if we have dysbiosis and if we have digestive imbalance, and if in particular, if we have reduced stomach pH, so stomach acid reduction, that can be from a number of reasons. Dysbiosis and leaky gut can be a cause of that. When we eat things that have the gluten protein and the casein protein, they don't actually end up getting broken down properly because of this dysbiosis, this poor stomach pH and so forth. And then with the leaky gut, we absorb the not all the way broken down gluten and casein proteins into our bloodstream. And what it turns out is that these two proteins in particular, when they're partly broken down and then absorbed through a leaky gut, they turn into what we call these gluteomorphines and caseomorphines. And so then they travel to our brains and the receptor sites for the morphine, and we actually get a drug effect from that. And so sometimes some of the symptoms people experience on an ongoing basis because of the regular exposure to these gluten and casein mimic being a drug addict. And so also pulling these out of the diet can have similar effects to removing a drug if you're a drug addict. So people can go through detoxes, all kinds of stuff like that. So it can be a big deal. You may notice if you start to remove these from your kid's diet that they have a big reaction, big response. They're unhappy. They go through the stages of withdrawals. And just know that that's actually a good sign that this is the right move to be making, because if they are addicted at that level, if they have those gluteomorphines, it points to and tells us that they did have a dysbiosis and a leaky gut situation that was significant enough that these were causing a serious problem. And if we're at that point, eating the gluten and casein cause such inflammation that we will never be able to heal our leaky gut as a result of continuing to eat them. Let's see. There's a comment. Oh, hi Judy. How you doing? Glad that you're joining us live. I always appreciate that. Also, you can ask some questions if you want, and I'll be here to answer live. Okay, so that's gluten-free, casein-free. And I would suggest that anybody who's looking to make dietary changes, if they have particular diagnoses, particular behavioral things, particular autoimmunity problems that we're trying to resolve, start here. It's the simplest. It's not necessarily easy because gluten is in everything, dairy's in a lot of stuff, but it's certainly the simplest way to go at the beginning. Okay, so we're going to get into some more of the other diets as well. So next, we're going to talk about what's called the specific carbohydrate diet, the SCD. And so what the specific carbohydrate diet is basically there is a list you get if you're on this diet of certain foods that are in the carbohydrate family that you're allowed to eat and certain foods that you're not allowed to eat. And the reason for this is what they discovered, or what the person who developed this, which is close to 100 years ago, is that, well, let's see, maybe I have this on my next slide. Oh yeah, here we go. So here's some words while I'm talking. So you're allowed to have what are called monosaccharides. And if you know anything about chemistry, the mono is telling you how many saccharides are in this molecule, or in this, in this saccharide. So these are single molecule structures in terms of carbs. These are simple carbohydrates, single sugar carbohydrates. And then they are easily digested and absorbed by our own intestinal wall. But complex carbohydrates, which are disaccharides, double molecules, or polysaccharides, which have more than two, are not allowed on this diet. And that's because our own body, our own gut and digestive system, with the human part of our digestive system, doesn't easily digest these type of carbohydrates, and we require help from our bacteria or from bacteria to digest these carbohydrates. But what has happened is because our diet historically has moved from a hunter-gatherer style, where it was a lot of vegetables and fruits, primarily what we could gather, and nuts and seeds, and then meat that we hunted and fished for, to a high carbohydrate diet that we see in the Western world in particular, that we've shifted our microbiome so much so because we're feeding now these particular bacteria that like those carbohydrates and break down the disaccharides and polysaccharides. And so we get either an overgrowth, if you want to call it that, or a an imbalanced growth. And so what ends up happening is when you limit your intake of carbohydrates to just monosaccharides, you end up starving out the bacteria that have taken over your digestive system and caused the dysbiosis, and you return a balance of the bacteria in your gut. So that's a specific carbohydrate diet, and this has been around for quite some time. I recently heard a lecture by one of the people who's at the forefront of this dietary approach now, and she mentioned the history of it was there was a woman, and I don't remember these people's names, unfortunately, but if you read any of the books, I think they talk about it. But her daughter was having all kinds of health problems, and nobody could help. Nobody figured anything out. And this is back in the 40s or 50s, I think. And so they sort of stumbled upon going to this one doctor who was elderly at the time, who had been helping people with these gastrointestinal problems by his special diet, where he told you certain things to eat and certain things not to eat. And he was, at the end of his career, and he hadn't really passed this dietary protocol on in terms of people, continuing it. And so this young girl's mom, they started the diet, and it helped the girl so much, cured all these massive symptoms that she had that no one would be able to help with. So the mom actually dedicated her life then to learning about it, to becoming a nutritionist, and to sharing the works of this diet, which is now called the specific carbohydrate diet. So it's actually a diet that was worked out many years ago. That's why I said almost 100 years ago, that was almost lost to the world, except for this one woman who's had such great response from her daughter that she took it on. She wrote the initial SCD book. She passed it on to, there's a woman now who is sort of like the figurehead of the SCD diet, who's written some of the landmark books, and she was directly passed on to that. I thought that was interesting. And then the other thing that this speaker mentioned was that the specific carbohydrate diet really only has to do with what carbohydrates you eat. So it doesn't necessarily tell you how many of them to eat, or whether you should eat, 50% of your calories in carbohydrates or 8% in carbs, or whatever the case may be. It basically just says the disaccharides and polysaccharides, these specific carbohydrates, don't do well in your gut if you have a dysbiotic gut microbiome and a leaky gut. And so just pull those out of your diet. It doesn't tell you anything else about how to eat or when to eat or anything else, except for don't eat these specific carbohydrates. So she mentioned, which I thought was an interesting consideration, kind of like with the gluten-free, casein-free, start with these concepts, and then you can build on top of them. So then the next one is called the GAPS diet, and GAPS is an acronym for Gut and Psychology Syndrome. So this work was built on top of the SED diet. So it shares a lot of the similarities of carbohydrate and particular foods not to eat and particular foods to eat. But it kind of gets a little more in depth with the leaky gut situation. And so there's several things added in that are vital and important to this dietary approach that are specifically aimed at healing the gut lining and improving the gut microbiome beyond just starving the so-called bad bacteria of our gut. So there's bone broth as a big foundation that the GAPS diet is built upon, And the bone broth has several really good properties to it that help our gut lining. One of those is glutamate, which is an important amino acid that we found has been shown to really soothe and support and help repair and heal those fragile gut lining cells. It also is really good with collagen and some of the other connective tissue proteins that help our digestive system stay in good strength. And then there's a couple other things here, low glycemic. Okay, there over on the right, you see probiotic-rich foods. And then fermented vegetable juices. And then there's fermented raw dairy. So these are also very important aspects of the GAPS approach, because you want to heal the gut lining with the bone broth and those properties, and then encourage growth of a variety of bacteria by having probiotic-rich foods, ideally wild fermented or fermented at home, so you get a good variety and diversity of microbiome. So that's the GAPS diet. It grew out of the SCD diet with a special emphasis on foods that repair and soothe the digestive lining, like bone broth and fermented foods. Bone broth gives glutamate to the digestive lining for repair, and fermented foods, I said all that. It can be useful for this in particular, like, I was saying, sort of start with the SCD. This can, oh, the font is small. I wonder which font you're talking about. Oh, on some of the diagrams, yeah. Sorry about that. I'll try to make sure I cover everything. Okay, so, and you can find out more. I mean, the internet is a splendid place for tons of information about each of these diets. So my purpose in today's class isn't so much to get into great detail of each of the diets. It's to give a general understanding of kind of what their purpose is and where they're coming from, and some of the pros and cons of them as we start to get to the end of our 7 days together and looking at what's the plan going forward. And so gluten-free, casein-free, we talked about SCD diet, we talked about those are sort of foundational potentially. And then looking at something like a GAPS is often helpful when you have a more inflamed or more damaged leaky gut, which you can tell sometimes by the psychology symptoms, and there's other ways of understanding the degree to which the leaky gut is happening. But because it has these other aspects that are directly pointed at repairing the gut itself and the gut lining, it tends to be used in cases where there's more of that inflammation and leaky gut going on. And sometimes we see that greater degree by symptoms, whether it's more intense ADHD symptoms, more intense autistic symptoms, more intense psychological symptoms, and that kind of stuff. Now, the one drawback is that for some kids, the glutamate in the bone broth can be too stimulating and can actually cause worsening of behavior, because glutamate is a potent neurostimulating amino acid. Sorry, blanking on the word there. And so because it's, there's a fair amount of bone broth in this protocol, especially early on, that sometimes it can be irritating and too stimulating. So there's a balance that needs to be reached in any of these in terms of getting the results, but also you don't want to do things that are like causing too much difficulty with the behavior, or the symptoms and so forth. So that's the one sort of drawback that people see with the with the GAPS diet. But there's been many years of really good results with this one. So this right here is a ketogenic diet food pyramid, and I like this just because it kind of gives a good visual representation. So these bottom 2/3 are all high-fat, low-carb foods. I mean, I guess these nuts have some carbs in them, but you got your meats, your chicken. This white stuff is coconut oil, you got butter, macadamia nuts, cashews, avocados, some different cheeses, eggs, bacon, and then our top 1/3 of the triangle here is leafy green vegetables, things like kale and spinach, broccoli, asparagus is in there. So those deep, dark, rich green leafy vegetables. So the idea with ketogenic, if you aren't familiar with it, the basics are that 60 to 80% of calories come from healthy fats. There's a very low intake of carbohydrates. It sort of depends on who you are following and what level of ketogenic diet you want to take. It also has to do with some with activity level. So it can be as low as 8% or under 10%, 12% of your calories from carbohydrates, and then the rest is from proteins. And so the ketogenic diet, the brief history is that it was developed. It was developed years ago, but it was seen several decades ago to be a beneficial diet for children who suffer from seizure disorders, and it had quite remarkable results. And then it kind of went back into the shadows again for a while, and then was again recently sort of rediscovered and found to be really effective for people who are wanting to lose weight. And also, now that we have better ways of testing and studying and analyzing what's really going on in the body with different dietary things, we found that it has a lot of neuroprotective benefits. So the idea is that when you shift your diet to 60 to 80% calories from fats and a very low intake of carbs, is that you change your metabolism from burning carbohydrates for sugar to burning fats for what are called ketones to feed your brain. And so what has been discovered is that ketones have these neuroprotective benefits. They help, essentially, and the simplified answer of that is that what they do is they help your brain cells heal and stay young and alive for longer, grow new connections, and have less oxidative stress on them while you're under ketogenics or ketogenesis. Ketosis. Ketosis is the word I'm looking for. So that is one thing, and that's part of why a lot of people, and it's anti-inflammatory in your brain too. So a lot of kids who are suffering from leaky gut syndrome, dysbiosis, that then has gone on to be causing a leaky brain and then inflammation in the brain. One idea is that the ketones in a ketogenic diet, because they're neuroprotective and anti-inflammatory in your brain, help reduce the symptoms of the leaky brain because they're reducing the inflammation and helping the neurons to function better with those stresses. It also, because you're limiting your carbohydrate intake, and in addition to just less carbs, there's also the concept of eating more fibrous carbs and less simple carbohydrates, or no sugars and stuff like that. And that's why in the food pyramid there was the leafy greens. And that's shifting the carbohydrate intake, one, making it much lower, and two, shifting away from grains and high starchy carbs, shifts the gut environment. And you also limit some of your prebiotics because you don't eat as many of the prebiotic foods. A lot of them aren't allowed on the ketogenic diet. So you have a shift, and you start to eliminate those bacteria that have been, and fungus that have been growing and overgrowing, that have been as a result of the high carb, high sugar diet that is so common and popular in our culture. So that's what we know about the ketogenic diet. Some people have said that they've gotten good results. It's all anecdotal at this point. As far as I know, there haven't been any significant, double-blind type studies or things like that. But it does show some promising qualities in the fact that it's neuroprotective, and it can help similarly to some of the other ones that limit carbohydrates. Now, I do want to say one thing here, and I don't want to get too far off on a tangent, but much like the SCD diet and even the gluten and casein free and now ketogenic, they basically tell you, those other ones tell you what not to eat. And the ketogenic diet goes a little like another step forward by telling you what not to eat, which is much in the way of carbohydrates, but also what to eat, so fats. But these approaches, these dietary approaches, don't say anything about where the food that you are eating comes from. So we live in such a strange world chemically, that if you think about our day when we were talking about all the causes of leaky gut, that no longer can we just say, 68% of your calories from fats, all right, just eat some eggs and a couple hamburgers, without the bun, and you should be good. Because when I say an egg, or you say egg, and somebody else says an egg, or I say a hamburger, and you say a hamburger, and somebody else says a hamburger, we may be talking about completely different foods from the sense of how much hormones are in them, how many chemicals are in them, if those animals ate the proper diet of what they're supposed to, like cows eating grass, or whether they were artificially fed, GMO soybeans that have been sprayed with glyphosate, and now their gut biome is totally out of whack, and so they produce meat that is now totally out of balance and out of whack, and so then we eat that, and so on and so forth. And then, was the egg, even if you and I both have an egg that was from pastured chickens, what if you fry it in high heat and canola oil until the yolk is solid, and I gently poach mine and liquid it with a nice liquidy egg, or liquidy yolk. We're getting such a different profile of nutrients in intake. And so the truth is that tends to be a limitation with any sort of diet that has a name, is that it doesn't talk about that. And the keto thing has gotten so popular. I don't know how tapped in some of you are to that, if you're on like Pinterest or your Instagram or any of those kind of things. But ketogenic is everywhere now. Every natural health expert has their plan and their book about keto, the keto diet. And there are, like I said, a lot of really beneficial things to it. But I've seen, some ketogenic cookbooks, and some of the recipes, while fitting the macronutrient profile, like 80% healthy fat, low carbs, moderate protein, what they're telling you to put in your food is like chock full of, highly pasteurized dairy and all kinds of problematic things that we know can cause GI trouble and intestinal issues and stuff like that. So ketogenic has made itself known in the world of kids' health and ADHD and autism and autoimmunity, but it's sort of like, that's really sort of not its main goal or focus or point. So we do see a lot of benefits with being fat adapted, which is what is called when you're in ketosis or eating in a ketogenic method. I personally eat quite a bit of fat. I don't know that I spend all day in ketosis generally, but I find it to be the most beneficial in terms of giving me energy through my day and all that kind of good stuff. But I wouldn't say that I follow the ketogenic diet specifically. I definitely don't do that with my kids all the way. But some of the principles we put in place. Let's see, I got some other questions here. So yeah, definitely. So I'm responding to this question here from Jennifer about her son. All he wants is bagels and cream cheese, and she knows she needs to get gluten and casein out for healing. Don't have the money for expensive alternatives. Yeah, absolutely. And also, the internet is a great resource for finding recipes to make stuff at home. I know sometimes that's not so easy, but also, there's a ton of gluten-free junk food out there. And so just because it's gluten-free doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting anything more beneficial other than you're cutting gluten out, which has its own benefits, certainly. So anyway, let's see. Why not keto for kids? I'm not necessarily saying that ketogenic isn't something to do with kids. You certainly can, or at least use ketogenic principles. And truthfully, a lot of the foods you can eat with keto, the ketogenic diet, kids often love, Like if we go back to this, I was looking at going through making this slideshow up with my 3-year-old daughter in my lap, actually. And she was like, I like those foods, and she's pointing at them all. And they tend to really enjoy these kind of things. She just likes eating butter plain and all that kind of stuff. But so it tends to not be that challenging in a sense, though. Obviously, if your kid is really into gluten and carbs, that can be tough. But the foods that you're replacing that with they are often foods that are enjoyable because fat is flavor. So there's nothing specifically against keto for kids. You would just have to do the math in terms of the macronutrients, how many calories your kid should be consuming based on their size and their age, and then adjust, in terms of how many calories or how many grams of the different things they're getting in their diet. And like I said, there's definitely some anecdotal evidence that this has shown benefit with kids with ADHD, kids in the autism spectrum, kids with autoimmunity. And I think it's limited to some degree if you just follow only the macronutrient profiles. All right, so this is the paleo food pyramid, or one version of it here. And so, and thanks to All Paleo Diet site, that's where I got this from. And so what this is showing us is the bottom of the pyramid is proteinaceous things, so meats and seafood, eggs, things like that. And then a large section in the middle is fruits and vegetables, and then nuts and seeds, coconut oil, and those type of things at the top up there. So the idea, if you don't know paleo diet, I imagine most people are somewhat familiar with it now because it's been around, and it had its famous days kind of predating the ketogenic fad we're in now. But the idea is that, just simply put, for a million or so years, or hundreds of thousands of years, depending on who you talk to about it, we've essentially been genetically about the same as we are now as far as humans go. And for the vast, vast, vast majority of that time, we didn't farm, and we most certainly didn't have processed foods or grocery stores or anything like that. But even farming has only come into human culture in the last 8 to 10,000 years. So for the vast, vast majority of human history, we didn't eat the products of agriculture, which are grains and dairy from cows for the most part. I mean, we had dairy because we would nurse our mothers, it was human dairy. And then, there's varying accounts of the history of when herding animals came into play and all that kind of stuff. But let's just say for the majority, the vast majority of human history, we didn't eat any of those things. We were hunter-gatherers, and then really primarily gatherers, because that was the easiest way to find food, especially when humans lived in temperate climates mostly, or not temperate, but jungle, the equatorial. So lots of fruits, some vegetables around, some nuts and seeds, and then we would also catch animals or fish or those type of things, eat eggs from other animals, because these are highly prized, highly nutrient-dense foods to get those fats. And then the idea is that once we spread out a little bit as a species to other climates where there was less abundance of sort of fruits and things hanging off trees, we moved more into hunting, started eating higher fat, higher brain nutrient rich diets in terms of the healthy fats and so forth from these animals, and started growing our brains actually at that time. And that's part of how we grew such big brains, is at least one theory. Now keep in mind this picture down here at the bottom, to truly be, well, I won't go off that tangent, just know that our Paleolithic ancestors actually didn't eat steaks so much. They would, when they would kill an animal, they would eat all the organs and all that stuff first. But that's the idea, is to try to be as in line with our sort of our genetic needs, or the makeup of our body as possible, by going back to sort of the paleo or primal concepts. And the idea is that a lot of the dysfunction, disease, and problems we have in our modern world are based on because we're eating these products of agriculture, which aren't really meant to be human foods. And it's interesting this concept, because what we know through biochemistry and studying human digestion, that eating grains pretty much always causes some sort of inflammation in our digestive tract. And so I think it's an interesting thing that we have made that such a big part of our dietary lives. Now, I understand where it fit into the human evolution, because it used to be in the hunter-gatherer days that one of the biggest threats to survival was famine. The weather would shift, things would happen, and you wouldn't be able to find food, and then animals would migrate and all that kind of stuff. So famine was a big problem, much more than it is sort of in our modern culture. And so as humans started to domesticate grains and do agriculture, it made a lot of sense, because you could harvest a whole field of wheat or barley or rye or some sort of grain and then store it over a long period of time, so that you always have food through the winter and through the different times of the year where food was scarce. And so it actually is a big part of why we were able to grow the density of our population of our species, is that we now were able to survive through famines. But now we've reached a point in history where we don't actually require that. That was a short span of time where we needed that to get to where we are now. But now we have a lot of modern farming practices and refrigeration and all this kind of stuff, and so we don't require to have those foods available to, for famines and so forth. So that's paleo. And then taking paleo one step further is what's called the autoimmune paleo, or the AIP, which is kind of what I wanted to get to. So the AIP is one approach that a lot of people have been using in the ADHD and the autism and autoimmunity world. And so it kind of takes the paleo concept, but takes it one step further. And so not only do you eat the Paleolithic hunter-gatherer things, there's certain things you eliminate, and there's certain things you eliminate for a period of time. So altogether, you eliminate things like nightshades, processed oils, berries, berry and seed-derived spices, grains, legumes, alcohol, eggs, coffee, cocoa, soy, dairy, NSAIDs, refined sugar, seeds, oils, nuts. And you do that because those are the most common allergens. And so the idea is that we want to eat how our Paleolithic ancestors did, because that's going to be the most in line with our genetics, our DNA, and the needs of our body. But because a lot of us have systems that have been so compromised, we have these food sensitivities and food allergies that have developed. So we need to remove those things to be able to, or the vast majority of them, to let our system heal and reduce that inflammation long enough. And then if you look over on the right, there's reintroduction. So after you've done that and you've healed and allowed the system to heal by eating things like coconut, which would be coconut oil mostly, herbs, spices, fermented foods, fruits, bone broth, meat, poultry, vegetables, healthy fats and oils, offal, fish. So then you eat those things for a limited time, and then you slowly, one food at a time, start to reintroduce these other things: nuts, seeds, eggs, coffee, thank God, cocoa, grass-fed dairy, nightshades, coffee twice. Oh, coffee, not. Anyway, so that's the idea. And then, so it's like an elimination diet using the paleo concepts. And, food sensitivities, food allergies have become very trendy lately, and there's tons of expensive testing you can do, which a lot of them honestly have varied. Like, some people will tell you this test, the IgE test, is the gold standard, and then you'll hear some other experts say, well, it doesn't really tell you everything. So there's some wisdom to doing an elimination style diet. It just takes time and attention and patience to really understand. But once you've eliminated the things that your kid is sensitive to in their diet completely, and allow time for their system to heal and rebalance, as you reintroduce those things, typically the signs and symptoms of problematic foods are very obvious. You'll see sudden and significant changes within a day or a couple of days when we reintroduce certain foods into the diet. So this, what's cool about this one is it has a foundational approach of the Paleolithic or the paleo style, but then there's also the removing the most common allergens and seeing, it's kind of like taking paleo to the next level, and, really helping to heal that gut when we have a seriously compromised situation. So that's what we see there. And then the next one I want to talk about is another acronym, and that is called the low FODMAP diet. And this one has its own food pyramid here. It still has a lot of grains and vegetables, fruits, dairy, proteins, and sweets. So what FODMAP is, it's an acronym, and I'm going to jump over here. So what it means is fermentable oligosaccharide, disaccharides, and monosaccharides, and polyols, which are the FODMAP. So the idea behind this is that this is a particular diet that's gained popularity in treating things like SIBO and the bacterial and fungal overgrowths, because since these are fermentable saccharides, what that means is that they, in our digestive system, they ferment, which requires the fungal species in our gut. So if we have an overgrowth, if we have a dysbiosis, the idea is that if you eliminate or reduce these foods from the diet, you starve out those funguses, and you allow the system to rebalance. So here's some examples: oligosaccharides. So these are also just poorly absorbed in general. So wheat, beans, pulses. Disaccharides. This is mostly lactose found in milk, such as cow and goat's milk. Monosaccharides, and so that's fructose. So a lot of fruits are counted out on this diet. And then polyols are sugar alcohols, which can be found in various diet and sugar-free foods. So like artificial sweeteners, like sorbitol and xylitol. Also in some stone fruits and some vegetables, so peaches, plums, mushrooms, cauliflower. So the idea is there are specific carbohydrates, essentially. They're fermented oligosaccharide, disaccharide, monosaccharide, and polyols, so FODMAPs, that they have found that people with certain digestive situations, like overgrowth and imbalanced growth, and SIBO and those type of things, tend to respond really well to a FODMAP thing. The thing about FODMAP, and some of these other diets in particular, but FODMAP I'd say the most, is that it's not really by nature intended to be a lifetime thing. Basically, the idea would be to remove these carbohydrates over a period of time, and ideally be doing things to heal your gut and create a bacterial diversity. But this can be very relieving a lot of times if people have a lot of IBS symptoms and GI distress, because a lot of what we are finding, a lot of GI distress and IBS and so forth, are actually as a result of different forms of bacterial overgrowths and fungal overgrowths. And so this tends to just starve all that stuff and kind of allow the system to get back to a reset point. So that's the FODMAP diet. Let's see, I got another comment or question over here. Tried to do a plant-based shake, all organic, but my son has eczema flare-ups about bone broth protein. And have you tried it yet, Kathy? Have you tried the bone broth protein and see if that's helping? I just recently was getting some bone broth protein to put in my smoothies that I was enjoying a lot. So curious to hear other people's responses with that. Yeah, I didn't talk about plant-based diet here. I think that's I don't know that that's a specific diet that's people are purporting to use to help with ADHD and those type of things. But I know that it's gaining a lot of popularity. We can really go into every popular diet right now. These are really the kind of ones focused on the leaky gut and the dysbiosis type situations. Maybe a different time I'll do a class about the popular diets. I've done that one in person around locally here, but I haven't done it online yet. I think it's fascinating. Anyway, so that's the FODMAP diet. So we covered several of the diets here. I'm just going to back all the way up. So we have the gluten-free, casein-free. We have the SCD diet, the specific carbohydrate diet. We have GAPS, the GAPS approach, the gut and psychology syndrome approach. So we take this SCD principles, specific carbohydrates, and then we add things like bone broth and fermented foods to that. Then we have a ketogenic diet, so that's the high-fat, low-carb diet. We have our typical paleo diet, which some people have found a lot of benefit and results. I will say on this one of the reasons why paleo works so well for a lot of people is what you notice is not present on this chart are any processed foods. So when you remove processed foods, you remove a ton of sugar, you remove a ton of preservatives, artificial colors, artificial flavors, well, actually all of those, and a lot of industrial oils and fats. And if you take those out of anybody's diets, I don't care how healthy you think you are or how unhealthy you seem to be, take those things out of your diet because it's going to benefit you in the long run. We have the autoimmune paleo, which takes paleo, it goes one step further in the sense of elimination diet added to the paleo concept. With the FODMAP diet, the low FODMAP diet. So those are really the most popular named diets that people have been using. And you can see that there's some sort of variance in them, that none of them have been studied that terribly well. The SCD the most, or I'm sorry, not the SCD, the gluten-free, casein-free the most, and we've seen some benefits. And there's a lot of anecdotal benefit and evidence from all of these diets of varying degrees or another. But and there's also a lot of people that say, oh, I tried that one and it didn't work. So I think what's important is understanding, which hopefully you have a better sense of now, that those first 5 days of our class, understanding what exactly is going on in your child's digestive system, in the gut, in the microbiome, and then applying that knowledge to deciding what dietary direction to go, what things to remove, what things to add, and so on and so forth. So I know that this is a lot to dump into one class. You know, each of these diets we could go deep into, but I wanted to give you all of these most popular diets and some sort of basic background at each of them. Let's see. Haven't heard of many of these. Yeah, well, haven't heard of many of these. Yeah, it's strangely enough, or not, kids' health is really not a big, popular health topic out there in the world. I mean, if you're in the world of it, you hear a lot and you see a lot about it. But in terms of like, if you just went to like a bookstore, if they still have those where you live, I know they don't have a lot of those anymore, and looked on the health shelf, you would find a whole lot more books about losing weight and getting to beach body and all those things than you would about anything related to kids' health. So a lot of these diets kind of stay in the background, but you'll see more of them coming forward. Leaky gut is the next new thing. So right now we're in the honeymoon phase with ketogenics in terms of the natural health world and what's popular. Next is going to be leaky gut and dysbiosis. So you guys also, in taking this class and learning these things, are at the forefront of understanding how our bodies work. Okay, so next time is going to be day 7 out of our 7 days. And so our agenda for next time is wrapping it all up, making a plan, and the next steps for healing. So we're going to take all these things we've learned, put them together, put them into use, and really take the step for the action steps. Because to sit here and watch these videos for 7 days is great. You're going to learn a lot of information. But if we don't then take the next step and put an action plan in place and really stay on top of it and be accountable to making these changes that are required to help our kids, to help our family, to help ourselves, then it's all kind of a waste. Because a week from now, 2 weeks from now, 5 weeks from now, you're not going to remember so much all this stuff, let alone start to get confused and so forth. So we're really going to wrap it up. We're going to put a bow on it. We're going to talk about making a plan and what the next steps are for true healing, getting to the root of the problem and really healing it. All right, I appreciate you guys for taking the time to be with us today. Those of you that are live, awesome. I'm so happy to have people on here with me while I'm talking. And then those of you watching on the video, on the recording, excellent too. I commend you for taking the time. I mean, these so far we've had 6, information-packed lessons. It's not easy stuff, and it's not necessarily easy concepts. So I commend you. I appreciate you for taking your time, for being with me, for learning, and for helping in my mission of making the next generation the best generation, whether that's, and that really happens one family at a time, one kid at a time, and it changes the world. Okay, so I'm going to sign off now, and we'll see you tomorrow for our final lesson. Bye.